Come join me on my second channel, Jaguar Gator 8, where we'll talk all things college football. New video drops every Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern. Click the card in the upper right corner to watch the latest video. And now, on with our feature presentation. Look, we all have our favorite announcers, and we all have our guys that we cannot stand. There's always one announcing team that makes you want to mute your television and makes you think that they have no idea what they're talking about, or they're so biased against your team that you cannot stand to listen to them. There are collective groans when you get Jay Feely or Jonathan Vilma on your broadcast, and when you're inviting them into your home for 3 hours just waiting for them to say something stupid. Fans complain about announcers all the time, and I am no different whatsoever. However, imagine a team hating an announcer so much that they requested that they be removed from their assignment of calling the game. Imagine if Andy Reid went to the press and said, "I hate Tony Romo. I hate that he's assigned to our game. I want CBS to remove him from the broadcast immediately, and I want to have someone else call the game." That seems ridiculous, right? And that seems even more ridiculous when you realize that, well, the coaches, players, and team personnel can't hear the announcers during the game because they're only relayed through the television. Yet as ridiculous as this hypothetical situation might sound, in 1987, that's exactly what happened. The Houston Oilers were so furious at the announcers that they were assigned that they requested that NBC change the pairing. And the result was a bitter feud between a network and a team that resulted in a whole lot of bickering, to say the least. This is the story behind the strangest announcer controversy in the history of the NFL on NBC. Before I talk about the controversy in question, we need some context to understand the game that was taking place, as well as who the announcers were and why one team was absolutely furious with this pairing. We were 60% of the way through the 15-game strike shortened 1987 season, and entering game number 10 of this rather bizarre year, there were two teams tied atop the AFC Central. In one corner, you had the 6-3 Cleveland Browns, who had won the division in each of the past two seasons, made it to the conference championship the year before in 1986 before John Elway did some things, and were one of the best teams in the NFL. Through 9 games, the Browns had scored 238 points, which was the second best total in the AFC, only behind the Miami Dolphins at 244, as well as the fourth best total in the NFL, only behind the Dolphins, the Niners at 250, and the Bears at 246. Being in the same company as two of the past 3 Super Bowl champions is not too shabby. They had a great defense that allowed just 131 points through the first 9 games for an average of just over 14 points per game. This was not only the best total in the AFC, but the best total in the NFL. And their point differential of plus 107 was the best in the NFL. It also seemed like the Browns were peaking at the right time, having won 4 of their last 5 games, including back-to-back victories against the Atlanta Falcons and the Buffalo Bills. Everyone expected the Browns to be near the top and to be leading the AFC Central. They had the best preseason odds of any team in the AFC to win the Super Bowl at 6-1. However, through 9 games, they were tied with another team atop the division, with this team coming completely out of nowhere. This team had awful 120-1 odds, and over the past 5 seasons had gone 16-57, winning less than 22% of their games. And that team that was stunning the football world and taking the league by storm was the Houston Oilers. Led by quarterback Warren Moon, the Oilers had a top 5 offense in the conference, a top 5 defense in the conference, and a top 5 point differential in the conference. Much like the Browns, the Oilers were playing some of their best football as of late, having won 3 of their last 4 games, including a dominant 23-3 victory over the Pittsburgh Steelers, where they held Pittsburgh to just 8 first downs. As a side note, to learn more about the game that the Steelers played before that one against the Oilers, click the card in the upper right corner. Entering this 10th game of the season, there was perhaps no bigger game on the schedule than this one between the Browns and the Oilers. There was a lot to play for, and even that's underselling it quite a bit. Not only are both teams fighting for a playoff spot, as there was a chance based on the day's results that the loser of this game that dropped to 6-4 would be on the outside of the playoff picture, but the winner of this game takes sole possession of first place in the division with 5 to go. And if the Oilers win in front of their home crowd, especially since they won the first meeting in Cleveland 15-10 during the replacement games, then they would own the tiebreaker outright over Cleveland. On paper, this was the biggest game that the Oilers had since 1980 during the Bum Phillips days and the Love You Blue era. It was so big that the Oilers sold out the Astrodome and sold standing room only tickets. But obviously, not everyone who cared about this game would be inside the 8th wonder of the world. You would have hundreds of thousands more, and maybe even millions more depending on how the TV maps looked, watching this game at home. And if they tuned into the game, who would they be listening to and hearing on the broadcast? Jim Donovan and Reggie Rucker. Oh boy. It seemed kind of weird that for a game this big, that NBC would assign 2 announcers very low on the depth chart for it. Assigning Donovan and Rucker to this game would be like if there was a battle between the Browns and the Bengals for first place in the AFC North right before Thanksgiving, and CBS decided that the game should be broadcast by Spiro Dedes and Jay Feely. God knows we don't need that. Even taking everything else out of the equation, the decision itself to have these two broadcasters commentating on this game seemed awfully questionable, simply from a depth chart perspective. Donovan had worked one game for the network before, and Rucker's reputation was completely shot by this point, with him almost being universally hated as a broadcaster. In fact, it was so bad that not even 3 weeks before this game, one writer said, "As we all know, anyone is better than Reggie Rucker." And he still had not recovered from losing all of his credibility from the Sam Wyche incident in 1984, when he said that prior to a game against the Cincinnati Bengals, he had dinner with Wyche, even though it was revealed afterwards that Rucker made up the whole story and never had dinner with the man. You can learn more about that bizarre saga by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, even if we ignore the fact that on paper, this broadcasting duo seemed like a poor choice for a game of this caliber, you have to consider the two men and their backgrounds. Looking at Jim Donovan, he was a sports anchor for WKYZ-TV, which was a television station in Cleveland. Donovan was thrilled to be asked to call this Browns-Oilers game, as again, this was just his second broadcast for the NFL on NBC. As Donovan said upon finding out that he was going to be getting the job, "I was so ecstatic I don't think my feet touched the ground for a day. The NBC officials told me I did a good job on the first game and would get back to me, but you're never really sure until you get that telephone call." Despite being new to the national scene, however, he was not new to Cleveland, as he was the play-by-play man for preseason games involving, you guessed it, the Cleveland Browns. As for Reggie Rucker, along with working some preseason games alongside Donovan, Rucker's claim to fame as a player was his time spent in Cleveland with the Browns. Rucker played 7 seasons with the Browns, and was still highly regarded for his consistent play with the team. By the time he retired in 1981, he was one of the best receivers in the storied history of the franchise. If you looked at every player in team history to have at least 300 receptions and 30 receiving touchdowns by the time he retired in 1981, you would have just 4 guys on that list: Hall of Famer Dante Lavelli, Hall of Famer Max Speedy, all 1960s team member Gary Collins, and Reggie Rucker. For this game, you had a play-by-play man who was a Cleveland sportscaster and was the preseason voice of the Browns, and you had a color commentator who worked in Cleveland and made his mark in the NFL with the Browns. You had 2 Cleveland guys working the national Browns-Oilers broadcast. And let's just say that the Oilers threw a fit about this. On Wednesday, November 18th, 4 days before the Oilers were set to take on the Browns, Oilers general manager Lad Herzig called into the network and complained to network football coordinator Ted Nathanson, saying that the announcer should be removed from the broadcast, because having 2 Cleveland guys broadcasting a Browns game seemed unfair to them and seemed like it would be a heavily biased broadcast. And considering the fact that the game was going out to 40% of the country, the Oilers didn't want their team painted in a negative light by the announcers, and wanted to make sure that the broadcast was as impartial as possible. As one Oilers spokesman said on the incident, "We weren't expressing questions about competency of the announcers. Both of them do a good job, or they wouldn't be at the network level. The only thing we were talking about is that they were Cleveland sportscasters, and the game is being seen in a large portion of Texas. In no way are we questioning their abilities as announcers." However, when NBC heard this complaint, they were absolutely stunned to say the least. They had no idea how to react at first, and after debating, they decided to go on the attack, criticizing the Oilers for having the nerve to voice this complaint. One NBC spokesman said, "I think they would have bigger things to be worried about. I've never heard this one before. It's a first." Executive producer Mike Wiseman expressed shock, disappointment, and anger as well. He said, "NBC Sports is disappointed the Oilers have publicly complained about Donovan and Rucker. Our announcers are not biased toward one team versus another. We don't tell the Oilers who to play a quarterback. They shouldn't tell us who to put as announcers." Before going any further, I should note that the Oilers never made any complaints in the past about Rucker, even though he was assigned to prior Oilers broadcasts. Rucker was on the call for their Week 6 game against the New England Patriots and for their Week 8 game against the Cincinnati Bengals, and was even on the call in 1986 when the Browns played the Oilers. The Oilers raised no objections over that. It was just the fact that you had another Cleveland guy in the booth that made them up in arms. And Wiseman said that these complaints were completely unfounded, saying, "This weekend, we have the Buffalo-New York Jets game, using Marv Albert, who is from New York and worked for WNBC in New York, and Joe Namath. We haven't heard one thing from Buffalo." As NBC noted, "We're not going to assign games based off of potential conflicts of interest simply from a geographical standpoint." Furthermore, even if NBC agreed with what the Oilers were saying, and even if NBC said that this was an oversight and that they should make a change, it was way too late to do that. For one, every other broadcasting pair was taken and had already been assigned their games. with some of the announcing duos higher up on the depth chart getting games assigned to larger percentages of the country. Plus, you don't just show up on the day of the game and call it. There is a ton of prep work that goes into it, involving hours upon hours of watching film, conducting pre-game interviews, and meetings with production members designed to hone in on certain elements during the broadcast. On top of that, there is the logistical elements like booking flights and hotels. You can't just change it on the fly, especially not this close to the game. If the Oilers had a valid complaint, they shouldn't have done so roughly 80 or so hours before kickoff. In other words, NBC just laughed in Houston's face when they requested this change, especially since this was literally the first time that any team ever called in to voice a complaint. And Reggie Rucker was absolutely furious when he heard this news. He thought it was a shot at his credibility. As he bluntly said on the situation and the protest, the network is never going to succumb to that kind of intimidation. The Oilers should spend their time worrying about the Cleveland Browns, not about objectivity. We'll take care of the objectivity on the telecast. With all that out of the way, we're finally ready to head to the Astrodome for this absolutely critical AFC Central matchup. Because now, on top of the high stakes that this game had on the standings, we had the entire drama taking place in the broadcast booth, with the Oilers expressing fears that this would be a biased broadcast, and NBC basically telling the Oilers to shove it. That raises two final questions we have to talk about. How did the game turn out on the field, and how did the broadcast turn out off of it? Well, regarding the first point, let's just say that when Rucker told the Oilers to spend their time worrying about the Browns, he wasn't kidding. Because holy cow, this was ugly. This was supposed to be Houston's statement game to prove to the country that they were legit, and that they were not pretenders, and that they could compete with the Browns atop the AFC Central for division supremacy. Instead, the game was anything but that. Houston busted out literally every trick play in their back pocket in the first quarter, and it didn't work. And when I mean every gadget play, I mean every gadget play. There is a fine line between creativity and desperation, and man did this reek of desperation. They tried a flea flicker on the first play of the game. They tried a double reverse. For some inexplicable reason that I don't get, they tried a direct snap to the running back on 3rd and 23, which had predictably laughable results. It was kind of funny to watch and see just how desperate the Oilers were, because not even FCS teams playing a number 1 ranked Alabama are this desperate. And that gives you a pretty good indication of how the game went, because it was ugly with a capital U. Everything that could have gone wrong for the Oilers on this day did, with the Browns leading at 9-0 at the end of the first quarter and leading 26-0 at the halftime break. When you're down by 4 possessions in front of your home crowd in a division statement game, yeah, that's not good. Cleveland led 40-7 at the end of 3 quarters, with Houston's offense being unable to get anything going all day long outside of one 83-yard touchdown pass by Moon to Ernest Givens, and the Browns ended up winning it by that final scoreline, making it Houston's biggest loss of the season, as well as their biggest loss since 1983, which was one of the darkest days in franchise history, as they lost 55-14 to the Cincinnati Bengals to drop to 0-10 on the season. The stats were downright embarrassing. Cleveland had 27 first downs compared to just 11 for the Oilers. While the Browns never turned it over, the Oilers turned it over a whopping 6 times. Cleveland held the ball for 42 minutes and 50 seconds, holding the ball for roughly 3/4 of the game. The Browns practically doubled Houston's total yardage, outgaining them 457-247, and more than quadrupled their rushing output, running for 200 yards compared to 43 for the Oilers. And starting quarterback Warren Moon had one of the worst games of his career. He went 5 for 23, completing just 21.7% of his passes while throwing 3 interceptions and posting a passer rating of 37, which is worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play. Eventually, Moon got benched after posting what was the worst completion percentage of his career in a game where he threw at least 15 passes. Oddly enough, the last time he played the Browns back in 1986, he also went 5 for 23. Not sure how that works out. So on the field, the game was a disaster. But off the field, how did the broadcast go? Were Houston's concerns justified? Let's find out. There are 2 elements with the broadcast that we have to talk about. Number 1, were the announcers biased? Could you tell that they worked for the Browns before, and could you tell that they were affiliated with Cleveland in any way whatsoever? And number 2, was the broadcast itself good? Was the broadcast tolerable on the ears, and was the average person watching this game back in 1987 wanting to reach for their remote to hit the mute button? And before we go any further, I have to say this. Jim Donovan was excellent. There's a reason he continued to get games for the next decade with the network. And there's a reason that he is still doing broadcast work in the NFL today, as he is the voice of the Cleveland Browns. I had no qualms with him whatsoever throughout the broadcast. Maybe he could have dialed it back just a bit, but it was perfectly fine. So with anything that I'm about to say in this segment and with this broadcast review, I am not talking about Jim Donovan, because he did good work as the play-by-play man. Having said that, let's start with the first point. Could you tell there was bias? Well, yes and no. Was Reggie Rucker rooting for the Browns in any way whatsoever, and could you tell he had an agenda? No. He was completely impartial in that regard. Early in the game, the Browns got a huge play down the field, and Rucker spent his analysis of the play talking about how the referees missed a call that should have had the play called back. Take a listen.
Watch number 81, Tennell. That looks like a pick there by Cody Rising. I'm not sure why Cody Rising was able to make contact with that defensive back. That's a little strange.
In that regard, it was perfectly fine. However, bias isn't just about not rooting for one team or another, and not using pronouns like we when talking about a specific team. It's also about research and preparation. If you know more about one team versus the other, or you have no idea what you're talking about with regards to one team, then that is a form of bias as well. And when the broadcast started off, Rucker did nothing to quell the fears that Oilers fans and personnel had, when one of the very first things he said was something that made absolutely no sense whatsoever when you break it down.
Warren Moon is having an amazing season. He is playing with confidence now. Everybody knows that he's been a fine passer, but the thing that he is doing this year is running with the football and doing it well.
Moon played 6 games so far in 1987, since he missed 3 games due to the strike. In those 6 games, Moon had a grand total of 89 rushing yards, averaging less than 15 yards per game on 4.05 yards per carry. Yeah, he's been quite the runner this year alright compared to previous years. Over the first 3 years, he was as mobile as Phillip Rivers, and now he's Lamar Jackson. Here's what makes no sense about this. If you look at his numbers through the first 6 games of every season he played at that point, from 1984 to 87, the numbers are practically identical on a year-to-year basis. He had 74 rushing yards through the first 6 games in 1984, 98 rushing yards through the first 6 games in 1985, and 94 rushing yards through the first 6 games in 1986. In fact, every single rushing statistic on a first 6-game basis, from rushing yards to rushing touchdowns to yards per carry, was better in 1986 compared to 1987. So I have no idea how Rucker can say with a straight face that, statistically speaking, Moon was having his best season running the ball and did nothing in that department in his first 3 years, when this was actually one of his worst starts to a season in that department. In that regard, Rucker showed immense bias and lack of preparation. As for the second point, Rucker was his usual self, and it's not surprising that by the end of the 1980s, Rucker was no longer working games. In fact, the biggest surprise might be the fact that he still had a job for so long after that whole debacle from 1984. Imagine having to listen to this riveting analysis and insight for 3 hours.
He's into it, the kick is up, and it is good. And the Browns get a turnover, but end up with 3 points. They probably feel they should have had 7, but the rookie Jagger knocks it through, and they now lead over Houston by a count of 9-0.
But the one thing that Cleveland does do there is they get back the point that they missed on the extra point fiasco, and at the same time, they're going to make Houston score twice in some fashion to gain the lead.
Rucker sure has a way with words. This game did not move him up the announcing depth chart, I'll just put it that way. But even despite Rucker not being good at his job, it's still hard to imagine something happening like this where a team demands that a broadcaster be removed from a game, not because of anything that they did in the past, but rather just the fear that they would do a bad job and be biased. The idea that a team would publicly complain about Joe Buck or Jim Nantz or Ian Eagle calling one of their games, and would aggressively pressure the network to do this and remove them from the broadcast, seems somewhat absurd in today's climate. But back in 1987, for the team formerly known as the Love You Blues, they weren't feeling a whole lot of love toward their broadcasting team. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9. To see college football videos, subscribe to JaguarGator8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.